Okay. It's my pleasure to welcome Michael Tobiasz to present his talk on the DNA case study of Judith Auerbach, a Theresienstadt toddler. Michael holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics and Physics from Glasgow University and a Master of Science degree in Genealogical, Paleographic and Heraldic Studies from Strathclyde University. He's the current president of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain and co-founder and board member of Jewish Records Indexing JRI Poland since 1995. He's an honorary research fellow in genealogical studies at the University of Strathclyde since 2020 and a former vice president of programming for Jewish Gen from 1995 to 2018. He was the database, matching consultant for the International Commission on Holocaust-era insurance claims. Michael received the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies Lifetime Achievement Award in Washington, D.C. in 2011 and was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to the Jewish community in the Queen's 2021 New Year's Honours List. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Michael to you all. Over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. I'll just start sharing my screen. Hopefully you can now see that. First, I must apologize for my voice today. I came down with a cold a few days ago, so I'm still coughing and spluttering a bit. Hopefully my voice will last out until the end. I've worked on several DNA cases over the last 4 or 5 years especially, and sometimes when I give these talks, I give a little background into DNA, but I'm not going to do that today because I think the longer I talk, the greater the chance my voice won't last. So if you don't mind, I'll go straight into the story. I'll be happy to take questions at the end, and if we run out of time or if my voice runs out, I'll also be happy to take questions and try and answer them by email. And I'm sure Terry will be able to supply my email address if you need it. So this is the story of Judith Auerbach. And don't worry if you can't read all of this massive amount of text on the screen. I'm reading it out to you. It's just so I don't have to refer to any notes. So Judith was born Judith Auerbach on 20th April 1942 in Vienna. After she was liberated from Theresienstadt, she was flown in August 45 along with several hundred child survivors to Windermere in the Lake District in England. You may have heard of the story of the Windermere children. From there, she eventually was sent to a hostel in Surrey where she was adopted. She eventually married, and the rest is history. She knew nothing, or pretty much nothing, about her family. She was so young when the war ended in 45. She was only 3 years old. She believed everyone had perished, and that's all she knew until she went to the Austrian embassy in the UK around 2002 or 2003, and she discovered that her father, Joseph, had apparently survived the war in Colombia. She found out the names of her mother, her father, and a couple of siblings. She was a bit puzzled, though. If her father had survived the war, why had he not come looking for her? Which is really quite upsetting. Early in 2023, with the help of the Wiener Holocaust Library in London and also various organizations in Vienna, she learned that her mother was called Brandla, and she had a brother Kurt and a sister Rivka, and they were all deported to Auschwitz in July 1942, and they perished almost certainly within a day. Somehow, and we don't know how, Judith was left safe in Vienna in a children's home. But she wasn't safe for long. She was only 3 months old at that point, and 2 months later, in September 42, she was transported to Theresienstadt, which is very scary, and you wouldn't expect a young child or a baby to survive for long. But she did. She survived, although at the end, when she was liberated, she was temporarily blind and she'd lost all of her hair, but she was alive. Now, the information we got from Vienna cast some doubt on exactly who Judith's biological father was, because apparently her father, Joseph, had left Vienna for South America in 1938 which was 4 years before Judith was born. So was he really her biological father? I don't think so. Now, there are various TV programs here in the UK. I'm sure you have them in Australia as well. There's one called DNA Family Secrets. I'm not sure if it was ever shown over there. And there was a story of a man called Jackie Young, who also ended up in Theresienstadt, and he was worried at one point in case his biological father was a Nazi guard. And so they did DNA tests, which showed he was 100% Jewish. So no, he wasn't the son of a Nazi. And they used the DNA to find some fairly distant cousins eventually. And I remember watching that TV program and I was shouting at the television because I was so unhappy about what they were doing and what they were saying. And I wasn't the only person unhappy. There were Jewish genealogists around the world when they watched that show and read the story in newspapers. They also were not happy with what had been done because they could have done so much better. And eventually, a couple of genealogists in New York managed to use the DNA and find much closer relatives for Jackie. So Judith had watched this TV program and she wondered whether DNA could maybe help her discover who her biological father was and maybe find living family members because apart from her own children and grandchildren, she had no other family. So I was asked if I could help. So the first thing I did was I ordered a couple of DNA tests. She was going to test with Ancestry and with 23andMe. And we tested with them because they're the two largest companies. They have the largest databases of people who have tested. And you cannot upload results from elsewhere to those companies. You have to test with them if you want to compare with their clients. But then once you've tested with these two companies, you can then upload your data to other companies like MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, Living DNA, and also a website called GEDmatch, where other companies allow you to upload to. So in the end, you can end up paying for two tests and actually compare your results with 5 different companies, the 5 main companies, which gives you access to maybe around 50 million people who have tested worldwide. So that's what we were going to do, but it was going to take 6 to 8 weeks to get the results. So meantime, I decided I would start doing some research because you can't just use DNA in isolation. You have to use it along with traditional genealogical techniques, which means you have to start building trees. Now, for someone like Judith, where we don't know much about her parents, and certainly not grandparents, I wasn't going to be able to do much work on her family. But once you start getting DNA matches and you can get people who might be second cousins or third cousins, they may have trees. The question is, do you trust their trees? There's so much information out there on trees which is unsourced and you can't really trust it. And sometimes you have to do research on other people's trees so that you can see where the matches might be. So I was going to have to get ready to do genealogical research the traditional way and build trees. So let me see what I can find out first about Judith and her family. And I searched online, and there are lots of databases online. You can search on JewishGen, that they have a Holocaust database. You can search on Yad Vashem. You can search the Arlson Archive. You can search the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. So there are several places on the internet where you can search, and most of these companies now are sharing the same information. And so you'll probably find the same data in 3 or 4 different places. So I searched here, and I'm going to show you information I actually found originally on the JewishGen website. And I found a deportation from Vienna in July 42 to Auschwitz. And it even had attached to it, I actually think this was from the Arlson website, I found this attachment. It was a typewritten list by the Nazis of the people who were on the deportation list to Auschwitz. And I'll just zoom in on the important section. And here we have number 393, 394, and 395, and we have the Auerbach family. We have Brandla, Kurt, and Rivka. We have their dates of birth. And you'll notice, if you can read the rest of the list, that all of the women and girls have got the initial S added to their names, which stands for Sarah, and all the men and boys have got ISR for Israel. And that's what the Nazis did. Basically, all the men were called Israel to identify them as Jewish. All the women were called Sarah to identify they were Jewish. And so here we have confirmation of Judith's family, her mother and her siblings, being sent to Auschwitz in July 42, but Judith is not there. She was somehow hidden away in a children's home. I also found some documents in Vienna which showed that Judith's mother actually had a brother, and he'd left Vienna for the then Palestine in the mid-1930s. So he had left before the war, and he had therefore survived the war. So we're making some progress. I also found documents which showed that Judith's mother's parents, her maternal grandparents, also left Vienna for Palestine in the mid-1930s. And this was really quite sad in a way, because Judith's grandparents lived in Israel and lived there until they passed away in the 1950s and 1960s. Her mother's brother lived in Israel and passed away in the 1990s. And all of that time, Judith had no idea she had such close family living in Israel. And of course, the family in Israel knew nothing about her because she was born in 1942 during the war. How on earth would they have known anything about her? There was no information. So I could start doing some digging in Israel. I'll just show you some of the documents from Vienna that I found, which gave us the information. So this is a document which was applying for permission to leave Vienna. And this is from Judith's maternal grandfather, Josek Chaim Kinrus, and he was born in October 1881. I've added this in red. He was born in Zagrody in Poland. And the document also shows that he was wanting to go to Palestine, where he had family members already, including J.W. Kinrus in Jaffa, his son. This was Judith's mother's brother. And also he had a brother, the grandfather had a brother, M. Kinrus, living in Tel Aviv. So we're now getting even more family members who were living in Palestine in the 1930s and clearly survived the war. Who was wanting to leave Vienna and go to Palestine? Well, there was the grandfather, and here's the grandmother, Treindl Kinrus, born in Chęciny, 22nd June 1882, and also listed is one of their grandchildren, M. Auerbach, who actually was Kurt Meyer, who was the young boy listed on the transport list. So for some reason, the grandson was mentioned as wanting to leave with the grandparents, but clearly he never left, and the grandparents left alone to go to Israel. Now, at this point, when I got this information, this began to ring bells, and I'm not quite sure about your own research, but I've lost count of the number of times I've worked on projects, and there's been some incredible coincidences, and bells ring, and you get the shivers. Because as soon as I saw where the grandmother was born, I was very excited, Chęciny, because that's one of my ancestral towns. And one of my branches lived in Chęciny from the 1820s onwards until they left and moved to Łódź in Poland, and eventually moved to Manchester and Liverpool in England just before the First World War. So through JRI Poland, I was very interested in Chęciny, and I have access to every single Jewish birth, death, and marriage going back to 1808. So I knew I was going to be able to do a lot of work on Judith's mother's family, her mother's mother's family. So none of the family in Israel knew anything about Judy. But because I have a contact in Israel who's incredible at finding living people in Israel, and we located Judith's mother's brother's daughter. In actual fact, Judith's mother's brother was married at least 3 times, had at least 2 families. And we located Daniela, a first cousin of Judy in Israel, her mother's brother's daughter. Daniela knew nothing about this branch of the family. Her father never said anything about a sister in Vienna prior to the war. He didn't want to talk about anything. So Daniela knew nothing. She had a few photographs. The families have been in touch via Zoom. So at least now we've already found a first cousin for Judy. She isn't exactly alone anymore. We have maternal cousins, first cousin, and lots of children and grandchildren. And now looking more into Chęciny, the document here is, as I said, one of my ancestral towns. This is the 1904 marriage of Judith's grandparents, Josek Chaim Kinrus and Treindl Rosenwald. And the Rosenwald family were absolutely huge in Chęciny. And so I went through all of the documents I had available. It only took a couple of hours, and I built a family tree of around 200 people going back to the 1790s. And this was going to be useful when we got DNA matches, that I would be able to hopefully fit them into this tree and find out exactly how they were related to Judith. This is the tree. Don't worry if you can't read it. It's just to give you an indication of the size of it. And this, as I say, goes back to the 1790s. I also found some really interesting documents in Vienna for the family. Some of these have been blanked out in sections because quite often the pages refer to multiple people from different families. It's not just one page per birth. It could be 6 or 7 births on one page. So the archives have blanked out the stuff that's not relevant. And the most interesting document we found was this birth record from 1936, which is Judith's brother's birth certificate. This was the Kurt Meyer, who was born in 1936 and who appeared on the deportation list. And the amazing thing about this birth record was it actually had attached to it in the archive a handwritten note from Judith's mother. And here is the handwritten note, which I had translated. And it says the child is named Kurt Meyer, grandfather is Joseph Kinroos. Well, we know that. I hereby declare the child born 29th August 1936 is the son of Joseph Auerbach, married 20th March 1935 in Katowice, Poland. However, my spouse does not know the existence of the child. Since I've not lived with him for 9 months, I don't know where he is. And this is witnessed in Vienna in March 1937. So this is the Joseph Auerbach, apparently Judith's father, who we know went in 1938 to South America. So he's not Judith's biological father. And we now know that he probably doesn't even know about the existence of Judith's siblings, or should I say, Judith's half-siblings. So he's definitely the father of Kurt Meyer, although he doesn't know. And then there was a younger daughter, Rivka, and he's probably not Rivka's father either. So we're not quite sure exactly who the father of Rivka is, and we're definitely not sure who the father of Judith is. But Judith's mother has been abandoned sometime in late 1935, not long after they were actually married. And he hasn't been seen since, and I don't think he met up with the family again after this point in time either. Now, Joseph Auerbach not only survived the war, but he actually went back to Vienna, and this is his gravestone in Vienna in 1996. I didn't know much about it. As you can see, there's very little on the stone apart from name and dates. So I did some digging around in Vienna and discovered that the burial had been arranged by a Cecilia Auerbach and Hans Auerbach, who were both from Bogota, Colombia. So I'm assuming that Cecilia is Joseph's wife and Hans is probably Joseph's son. So can I locate them? So I tried to do some research in Colombia. I contacted a Jewish genealogist in Colombia, and they tried for several weeks but couldn't find anything. And it's actually quite difficult. It's difficult doing research in South America, but it's also difficult locating living family members. I used Facebook, I used LinkedIn, and I actually found some clues to a Hans Auerbach using LinkedIn, and then began to Google that information. And I eventually found a person who I thought might be the son, and I even found a phone number listed on Google. And so I sent a WhatsApp message to this man in South America. Didn't know if he would speak English, so I sent a translated message in Spanish. And I got back a reply. He was very suspicious, but eventually, after I gave him the names of his father's siblings and information about their parents, he realized that I wasn't some kind of scammer, and he said, yes, he was indeed the son of Joseph, who was buried in Vienna. And he gave me this story. So his father had arrived in Colombia in 1938. In 1964, the three of the family traveled to Vienna and stayed there for a year and then returned to Colombia. Later, his parents went back to Vienna permanently, where his father died in 1996 and was buried there. And Hans and his mother returned to Colombia, and his mother passed away 4 years ago. His parents had married in December 1940, and Hans was born November 41. So Hans was born just 3 or 4 months before Judy. Hans knew nothing about his father having another family in Vienna. And we don't know of Joseph and Brandla getting divorced. So it looks like He got married in South America when he was still married to Judith's mother. It didn't really shock Hans, however, that his father possibly had this other family. His father was quite secretive. He was desperate to get to Vienna and search for family, but he always talked about his father's siblings, never about any children he might have. He did have a couple of photographs of children that he always kept with him in his wallet, but he never ever said exactly who they were, and the family assumed that they were possibly his nieces and nephews, but they may have been his actual children. So Hans was actually very interested in the story, and he's so interested that he hopes to get to London sometime this year or next year if he can make it. He wants to meet Judith. So they have no biological connection, but they do have this strange connection in that his father was married to Judith's mother, but they have no biological connection. And now finally we get to DNA. So I've done as much work as I can. I've located some family in Israel, but we really would like to know who was Judith's biological father, and can we find any family on that side, as well as other family members on her mother's side. Now, I am actually going to go through some of the basics of DNA here. I wasn't sure if I kept the slides in, but I did. I don't know if you've seen anything like this before. If you've seen it before, I apologize. So we all have pairs of chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes, and I'm going to look through. Let's just pretend we're looking at chromosome number 1, and we're looking at the grandfather and a grandmother, and they've got 2 copies of chromosome 1. And they have children. We have a son and a daughter. The only thing you can say for sure about DNA is that children will inherit exactly 50% of their parents' DNA. And what happens is the grandfather passes on this chromosome number 1, and as they're passed on, the son gets 50%. Now, I've actually simplified things here, and I've given the son 50% of the blue and 50% of the purple, and 50% of the red, 50% of the orange. In actual fact, it doesn't have to be exactly 50% of each of the pairs. He could have got 70% of the blue and 30% of the purple. He'd still have half of his grandfather's DNA, but simply not half of each of the pair of the chromosomes. And you can see the daughter also has 50-50. But if you look at the siblings, and there could be more siblings, they match slightly different parts of the DNA. And that's why when you look at siblings and siblings take DNA tests, they can actually share different amounts of DNA with different siblings. It's because they've inherited a different 50% from their parents. Now, of course, things get more complicated. The children marry, and they have their own children. And as you go further and further down the tree, the DNA gets more mixed because you've got inherited DNA from more and more ancestors. And these are called segments. The grandchildren have inherited 50% from each of the parents, and on average, they will have inherited 25% of the grandparents. But it's no longer an exact number. Children exactly inherit 50%. Grandchildren exactly inherit 50% of their parents. But as far as grandchildren and grandparents are concerned, on average, they'll inherit 25% of each grandparent, but that's just an average. They might only inherit, in this case, as you'll see, this grandchild has got lots of the red and orange from the grandmother, but not so much of the blue and purple. This grandchild still has 50% of the father, but does not have 25% of each of these grandparents. They've got something more like 60 or 70% from the grandmother, and maybe only 30% from the they've received about 30% from the grandmother and 20% from this grandfather. This grandchild is very different. They've inherited more blue and purple, more from the grandfather, and less orange and red from the grandmother. And as you go further and further down these trees, the amount of DNA you've inherited from your ancestors gets smaller and smaller. And for every relationship in a family tree, you can share a wide range of DNA. So when you take a DNA test and you get back this number, it's called the number of centimorgans. It's a measure of how much DNA you share with someone. For any given number of centimorgans, it could represent 3, 4, 5 different possible relationships, because this wide variety, because of the random nature of the way DNA is inherited, you cannot say for sure exactly what the relationship is. It could be a whole set of different relationships. And until you do more research, you won't know for sure exactly which relationship is the correct one. And there's a good website called DNA Painter. And on there, you can get a list of the kind of ranges of DNA for each possible relationship. Now, this table has been built up from real life. So this is where researchers around the world have taken DNA tests in their family, and they know exactly how the family members are related. And now we can see exactly how much DNA, how it varies. Now, the numbers, if you see something like 2C, it means second cousin. If you see 1C, 1R means first cousin once removed. And just to give you some examples, for a first cousin, using real life examples, first cousins have been known to share as little as 396 centimorgans, but as much as 1397. So it's a wide range. You could share as little as 400 and as much as 1400 centimorgans. Second cousins have been known to range right round from to 40 to 600. It's a massive range. Third cousins can share 0 up to 234. So when you get up to the third cousin level, because of the random nature of DNA, not all third cousins will show up as matches when you take a DNA test. And obviously, as you get lower down the third cousin, the higher the chance that you will not show up as a match on a DNA test. So don't be surprised if someone in your family who's a third cousin takes a test and they don't match. It doesn't mean there's a mistake somewhere. It just means that because of the inheritance of DNA, they have not inherited any DNA that shares with you. Now, we got back the results for Judith, and this is the table of results from the Ancestry DNA test, and we have a superb result. If you've ever taken a DNA test yourself, you'll probably realize that Ashkenazi Jews, if they take DNA tests, get huge numbers of matches. On Ancestry, I think I have 160,000 matches, and I'm not going to research all of them. And so the best one on Ancestry for Judith was Schlide H, who turned out to be a man called Howard Schleider. And Ancestry says they think he's probably a first or second cousin. Don't always believe what Ancestry or any other site says. That's an estimate. It doesn't mean that that's definitely the connection. What's more important to look at is how much DNA is shared, which is 625, which is a really large number. And that's going to be really useful to work out how they are related. On 23andMe, there were lots of really good matches, but the two best ones were Kerry, and I've converted their percentage of DNA into the amount of centimorgans, 373, and a woman called Ruth, 336. And there were lots of other ones, not quite as good as this, but still good matches. Personally, I find if you match anyone less than 100 centimorgans on a Jewish family, it can be really quite hard to locate where the connection might be. Now, several of the DNA matches that I found, when I looked at their trees, I saw there was a connection to a Rosenwald family, and guess where they were from? They were from Chencini. And so I managed to fit them exactly to the tree I'd already built. And now Judith has many second cousins and lots of third cousins, mostly in the USA and Israel, all on her maternal side, all on her mother's side. So she has a lot of family now. But nothing that I can tell yet is on the father side. The other interesting thing about the DNA Painter website is that if you click on the how much you've matched, and here we have Howard Schleider again, and I know, having contacted him, that he was born about 1960. DNA Painter tells us the percentage probabilities of what relationships you might have. So this is the top group. These are the most likely. Then there's a 34% chance of these, and there's a 1% chance, i.e. it's very unlikely, but it's possible it's one of these. Now, given that Howard was born 1960 and Judith was born 1942, I'm assuming for the moment there's a one generation difference. That doesn't always happen. You've probably got large families in some of your branches where there were large numbers of children born over a 20-year period, all in the same generation. So you can't always say that 18 years will be a different generation. But for the moment, I'm going to assume it is. My gut tells me that it is. And if you look at the top probabilities, you can see here that most of the relationships are much further out than one generation. We've got great aunts and half great nieces. The only one here, which is one generation out, is first cousin once removed. So that's very likely. If we go down to the next band, the only ones which are one generation out are half aunt, uncle, half niece, nephews. In this case, it would be half aunt, half nephew. But they are so close, and from what I know of Howard's family and Judith's family, I just don't think it's going to be one of these relationships for the moment until proven otherwise. I'm going to assume, and my gut tells me it's going to be first cousin once removed. And this is a small tree I put together with information from Howard. So we have Howard, and I've marked him in green. And if you remember, the best match I had on 23andMe was a woman called Kerry. Well, Kerry turns out to be Howard's niece. And so it's not surprising that she shares roughly half the amount of DNA that Howard shares with Judy. And that's what you expect. On average, as you go one generation lower in the tree, they will share, on average, half the amount of DNA as the higher generation. Now, the question is at this point, well, how is Howard related to Judy? Is it through his father, Samuel, or is it through his mother, who's no longer with us? Is it through Sarah Chimes or Chimes? Now, Samuel Schleider was born in 1937, so he's 4 years older than Judy, and he is still alive and living in Florida. So the first thing I do is ask, can Samuel please take a DNA test? Because you want to test the oldest living generation. And Samuel agrees, but it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks to get the results. And I'm not going to sit and twiddle my thumbs for 6 to 8 weeks. I'm going to continue doing some research. And it's a bit confusing looking to see where Samuel's from. Samuel's born in a town called Stanislavov. Stanislavov was in Poland between the wars, but it's now in Ukraine. And the name of the town these days is Ivano-Frankivsk. And Stanislavov is 500 miles from Vienna. So could this really be the connection to Judy, or are we probably looking at the line from Sarah that we don't know much about yet? Well, it's not totally impossible that this family from 500 miles away could be the connection, because Stanislavov, which is now in Ukraine, was part of what's known as Galicia. If any of you have got Galician family, you'll know that. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course, Vienna was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and many Jewish families and non-Jewish families from elsewhere in Galicia did move to Vienna in the early part of the 20th century. So it is possible that the Schleiders moved to Vienna. And when I was doing this research, I began to search some databases in Vienna looking for Schleiders, and I found some Schleider records, and I was getting really excited. Until Howard said, stop, it's a dead end. You don't want to look for Schleiders. Why? Well, it seems that Samuel in the tree was a son of Marcus Schleider, but it turns out he wasn't the son of Marcus Schleider. Samuel was actually the son of a man called Haskell Bernstein. It's getting a bit confusing now. And the story is this, that during the war, we have Samuel, who was born just before the war. And during the war, Samuel and his parents, Haskell and Sarah Levinson, were all in the ghetto in Stanislavov. And Samuel's father, Haskell, managed to smuggle his wife and son out of the ghetto, where they were taken in by a non-Jewish family, hidden under the floorboards in their house along with 12 other Jews, and they survived the war hidden in this house. Haskell wasn't so lucky, he perished in the ghetto. Excuse me. After the war, they'd survived, Sarah and her son Samuel ended up in a DP camp in Italy, where Sarah Levinson met a man called Marcus Schleider, and they married, and they had a daughter, Gina Schleider, in Florence, Italy in 1946, a half-sister to Samuel. And then the family went to the USA, where where Marcus Schleider decided to adopt Samuel as his own son, and that is when Samuel took the name Schleider rather than Bernstein. So I'm not looking for a Schleider family at all. I'm looking for Bernsteins. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, oh my God, it's getting a bit complicated now. Surely this is not going to make it easy. But with DNA, this makes it very easy. It's incredible. So I began asking questions about Samuel and his half-sister. Did Samuel's half-sister, did any of her family in America take DNA tests? And the answer was yes. One of her daughters, Sharon, took a test on Ancestry. But I didn't find Sharon and Judy as matches. I had another look, and I found Judy and Sharon were indeed matches. But Sharon only matched Judy by 20 centimorgans. Now, if the connection between the families was through Sarah, the grandmother, who was common to both, then you'd expect Sharon and Howard to share roughly the same amount. Again, because of the randomness of DNA, you wouldn't expect Sharon to match by 625, but you would expect maybe 500, maybe 700, maybe 400, maybe 800. You would not expect 20. It's just impossible for Sharon to inherit 20, for Howard to inherit 625, and be related to Judy through the common grandmother. It's just not possible. And that tells us a great deal. So we have Samuel taking a test. I also took Judy's DNA and Howard's DNA and uploaded them to the GEDmatch website because I could then compare their X chromosomes. The X chromosome is one of the sex chromosomes. Howard received his X chromosome from his mother, and he received his Y chromosome, his male chromosome, from his father. So the only way Howard received an X is through his mum. Judy received an X chromosome from both her mother and her father. That's what happens. Women inherit an X from both parents. Men inherit an X just from the mother. Now, Howard and Judy do not match on the X. There is absolutely no common X chromosome between them. Now, up until a few years ago, I would have said, well, if there's no match on the X, the connection cannot be through the mother. But in actual fact, it's not as clear cut as that. If you think of the mother with this pair, she has two X's. She's had an X from her father, an X from her mother, and she has a son. So Sarah has two X's, and she's going to pass an X on to Howard. When she passes on those X's, normally what happens is the X's are what's called recombined, and a mixture of the two X's is passed on to Howard. Again, this is random. You'd expect on average Howard to receive roughly half of each of the X's that his mother had. But it doesn't always have to be 50%. It could be 60-40, 70-30. And it used to be thought that in very, very strange, rare cases, a mother could pass on one entire X and nothing from the other one. She might pass on just one of the two and no combination whatsoever. Now, it used to be thought that happened maybe 1% of the time or 2% of the time. Recently, it's been said, no, it can happen 10 to 15% of the time. So the fact that Judy and Howard don't match on the X, I can only be maybe 85 to 90% sure that the connection is not through Howard's mother. But I'm still going to run with that until proven otherwise. So Judy doesn't match an X with Howard. Judy doesn't match Sharon by as much as we'd expect if the connection was through the grandmother. So we're now helped. As far as I can see, Judy and Howard do not connect through Sarah, the mother. As far as I can see, Howard and Judy do not connect through the paternal grandmother. Otherwise, the X's would have matched. That tells us that Howard and Judy must connect through Howard's paternal grandfather, Haskell Bernstein. Now, at this point, I'm fairly certain that Howard and Judy are first cousins once removed. That means that Samuel in Florida is Judy's first cousin. That means that Haskell Bernstein from Stanislavov was Judy's uncle. And that means that Judy's biological father was a Bernstein, was one of Haskell Bernstein's brothers. So I now have to research the Bernstein family. And of course, I'm lucky. I'm heavily involved in JRI Poland, and I have access to every single Jewish birth, death, and marriage that's publicly available for this town of Stanislavov. And I research, excuse me, the family of the Bernsteins, and I discovered that Haskell was one of 12 siblings. Not so good. He has 6 brothers and 5 sisters. I'm going to have to go through every one of his 6 brothers, seeing if I can find any connection. And so I start with the oldest brother, who was called Hirsch. And it didn't take long to discover nothing. I could find absolutely nothing about Hersch Bernstein. So I moved on to the second oldest son, the second oldest brother, Chaim Bernstein. Now here is the birth, the birth registration of Chaim Bernstein in Stanislavov. If you've ever seen Galician records, this is what they look like. They're tabular in form. So we have here actually 6 different birth registrations on a one page. I've highlighted in red Chaim Bernstein, and he was born on 24th November 1894 in Stanislavov. So I start to search for Chaim Bernstein online, and I get some hits. And I at this point, I not only do I get hits, I also get the shakes, because I find this, and again, you'll find this on several different databases. Here we have a deportation list from Vienna to Auschwitz for a Chaim Bernstein born 24th November 1894. Now, how many Chaim Bernsteins will there be born on that exact day? It could be coincidence, I guess. And he was deported from Vienna on the 17th of July 1942, which of course is the very same day that Judy's mother and siblings were deported. Not only the same day, it was actually the very same transport. Is this a coincidence? I decided at that point I would have a closer look at the deportation list, and you'll remember this from before. We had number 393, 394, 395, the Auerbach family, and guess what? Number 396 is Chaim Israel Bernstein, born 24th November 1894. So not only was he on the same transport, he's actually listed immediately after the Auerbach family. This is surely the correct man. This must be Judith's biological father. Not only were they in the same transport, it looks like they were rounded up at the same time and added to the list. Now, just to be absolutely certain, is there any more information I can find? Well, there we have Chaim. We also have a last address. There are actually several different documents referring to this deportation. And on one document, it actually tells us where Chaim had been living prior to deportation. And he was living in Vienna, district number 2. And it was the street called Grossberggasse, apartment number 39A. So I decided to search the database for that address. And guess who else was living in the apartment? Well, it was the Auerbach family, living in the very same apartment on the same street in the same district, along with Chaim Bernstein. So there now is no longer any doubt whatsoever. Chaim Bernstein was Judy's biological father. Now, at that point, we are fairly certain the family in America began to Zoom with Judith. So she now has Samuel Bernstein in Florida, who was a first cousin on her father's side. The DNA result came in from Samuel, which confirmed what we thought. He matched 950 centimorgans with Judy, 100% one of these relationships, and born 5 years before Judy. He's certainly not a great grandparent or a great aunt, uncle, or a great niece, nephew. The only possible relation is first cousin. So this is not only fantastic news for Judith because she now has family on her father's side and she knows exactly who her biological father was. It's also good news for Samuel because Samuel has gone through life believing he's the only living member of his father's family, but no longer. He now has Judith and her family in the UK and also in North America. And that is the end of my story. That's just about on time, I think, and I do have a bit of time left to take questions if you have any questions, and I'll stop sharing at this point.
Unmute, Max.
Yeah, I think you're still muted, Max. Well, I see we do have one hand up. I don't know if anyone's been posting any messages in the chat, which is where most of the questions will normally come in. Terry, can you unmute?
Yes, I've unmuted. Okay, so right, so perhaps if you'd like to either unmute yourself, you can do it one at a time, or put a hand up that you have a question, and we'll do it that way. So I think we've got Oppo A545G. Is that right? Wants to ask a question? Yes, no?
Hello,
Yes, go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, well, look, I've got a book being written for me, about me. I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I'm the youngest one that's on record, and my surname is Buch, B-U-C-H, and my father perished, all my family perished, but I would like to know whether I do have any relatives in the whole world, and I've tried to look it all up and written to the Claims Conference and all these places and Israel. So is there some way that I could communicate with you to
Yeah, if you
find
want to contact me via email, yeah. Have you taken any DNA tests?
Yes, I a long time ago, when my mother was alive, we did all that.
Right.
But I would like to, I suppose, start afresh.
Okay. Well, if you contact me, Terry, can you arrange for everyone to know my email address? I'm happy for
Yes,
it to be shared,
we can do that. Yep.
and I'm happy to give you some advice and possibly take it further.
Could I give you my telephone number through, or is that all right?
Well, the best thing to do is if you email me first of all, and we can take it from there.
How do I email you?
We'll provide all that information. So we'll send an email out to all members with Michael's email address, and then you can contact him that way.
But I'm not a member.
Well, get on to our website, AJGSPIC,
And join.
make contact that way.
Well, actually,
So
can everyone see the chat, or is it disabled?
How do I
No,
join?
the chat should be there.
Well, let me just put my email address in there.
Okay. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, everyone's got it. Thanks, Michael.
Right, yeah. Okay, do we have any more questions from anybody? If anybody wants to pose a question on chat.
You're
Right.
all asleep or bamboozled.
No, we're not.
I think we're
Hi.
amazed at the track that you took and the success you got. Just amazing. I think Peter Taft has got a question. Unmute, Peter.
Yep. Okay. Can you hear?
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Look, just, one thing we don't see a lot of, or at least I don't see a lot of, is South American connections, particularly outside of Argentina. And I'm just interested to know if you're able just to give us a little bit of background as to how much of your research has involved perhaps some of these more obscure South American countries, and what the state of the records is like. If somebody does find a connection there, how likely are you to be able to find something?
There are a couple of societies, Jewish genealogical societies in South America. And I actually do have some family in Buenos Aires. So for working in Argentina, I know who to go to if I have any questions. Yeah, an interesting story. My grandfather, shortly after he married my grandmother in Glasgow, didn't come back for his lunch or dinner one day, and my grandmother was getting very worried. And 6 weeks later, she got a postcard from him in Buenos Aires to say, "Hello, I'm here looking at my cousins. I wanted to visit." And thankfully, he returned, and my father was born, and I'm here to tell the story. So Argentina is not so bad. You can also find on some websites there are some records of boats arriving in Argentina from Europe. So you can find some immigration records. You'll also find some records on Family Search. some temporary passports for people who were traveling to South America. But it is difficult, and I'm not quite sure. I didn't think much of Colombia at all until I've done a lot of these DNA things in the last 4 or 5 years. I don't know what happened with COVID, but as soon as COVID started and people were locked up in their houses and doing some research for the first time in many years, suddenly people began contacting me about DNA and they couldn't match up their results and they wanted help. And I've now dealt with, I think, 2 or 3 cases where family had gone to Bogota, and I've got no idea why they went to Colombia rather than somewhere else. In the end, though, I found that researching in Colombia turned out to be very difficult. Although I'm just very, very impatient, and having not had any success after 2 weeks, I was very unhappy. But 2 weeks isn't really a long time. So use Facebook. There are lots of interesting Facebook groups for genealogy. So post messages, and there will be some members of those groups in South America who can possibly help. If you're looking for family members and you know their names, search the names on Facebook. You may find some of the descendants are members of Facebook. I also use LinkedIn, as I mentioned earlier, and I found people that way. But then you've got to be very careful when you contact these people, because contacting them, cold calling, is a little strange, and they don't always take kindly to it. But it can be done. But I would first of all maybe ask for advice also on Jewish Gen, if you are members of Jewish Gen and you're members of their discussion groups. Also, if there's any link to Poland on JRI Poland, post messages, and you just never know who out there is going to have some information which might help. They might not know your family, but they may have done research in the same area you're looking at.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. My wife's Scottish.
All right.
Born in Glasgow, and her family name is Sherman.
Okay. I'll have her in my tree, I'm sure. For the last 12 years, I've been researching the Jews of Scotland, and I have a family tree of 105,000 people going back to 1770. So she's probably on here somewhere.
Well, her grandfather was Gay Vartan, and he came from Russia.
Was her grandfather in Scotland at all? Did he come to
Yes,
Scotland?
yes.
So
Yes,
what was his name? His first name?
His name is Gavartan, Gavarten. And the interesting story is that when he escaped from Russia, he landed somewhere in Leith, which is in
Leith's the
Glasgow.
port of Edinburgh. I think
Yeah.
that must be Lewis Gavartan, married to Betsy August.
That's it. That's it.
They had
That's her
they
family.
had 8 children in Glasgow.
Yeah, that's them.
Yeah.
And he couldn't speak English, and they told him to go Vartan, which means go and wait. And he thought, and that was his name for the rest of his life.
Rodney,
I don't trust these old wives' tales. You hear it's a bit like the stories of people getting their names changed at Ellis Island.
No,
So
well,
yeah, I hear all the time that people arrived in Leith and they were told, "Oh, it's America. Get off the boat. It's America," or "Your
That's
name's
right.
now such and
That-
such." It didn't
that's
happen.
right.
The
His
boats
name
didn't
was-
come. The boats
his
didn't
name
come
was
to Glasgow
Khan.
and then go to America.
No,
Yeah.
his name was Khan, but they wrote down Gavartan.
Well, his wife's name, certainly August, is correct, and they married in
Yeah,
Vilnius on 15th of
right.
March 1902. I
Yeah.
would search the Vilnius records and see exactly what his name was.
No, his name was Khan, C-A-H-N,
hmm.
something like that.
Well,
And
I would still
they-
search in Vilnius.
August people went to America.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Well, I don't have a question, but I was born in Glasgow also.
Oh wow,
Ah,
okay. We've got lots of Glaswegians here.
Veen family, and Dad
Right.
was the Rose Rosenberg family.
Okay.
My goodness, that's wonderful.
What was your dad's name?
Philip.
Philip Rosenberg.
Philip, well, they changed it to Rose. I don't know at what stage.
Yeah. We have hundreds of Rosenbergs. Let me see if I can find a Philip. What year was he born? 1901?
No, 1909.
1909. Married to Bessie Yetta Levine
Yes, my mother.
and Gwendoline Briner Rosenberg.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, I've got them, and I can take them back to great grandparents.
Oh, wow. I'll contact you by email.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And my great-grandmother's cousin was born in Edinburgh.
All right, I'll have them as well. If
Yeah.
anyone has any Scottish connections, get in touch. And I've probably got some information for you, and you might have some information for me.
And another distant relative was a rabbi in Aberdeen.
All right.
But only very briefly.
Yeah. Yes, the congregation in Aberdeen was very small and not very long lasting, although there's still a small population up there.
Well, I think he would have stayed longer, except he died. So,
I think, Renee, have you got a question?
Yes, I have. Hi, Michael.
Hi there.
I have done the my DNA, and on my heritage, on Ancestry, how it goes with mother and father. It shows that. Well,
Yeah.
3 of my cousins, my second cousins, show up as being on my mother's side, yet I know that they're on my father's side.
Yeah. You can't
Is there
trust Ancestry. You don't trust it. It's fine
there a
mostly for
percentage?
non-Jewish families. It cannot handle Jewish DNA because we're all related somehow. That's why you've probably got 100,000 matches on Ancestry
Oh,
because
yeah.
we share so much DNA going back for so many generations. You are actually connected on both sides of the family. You will have matches that are both maternal and paternal. And Ancestry gets very confused and cannot figure out whether it's paternal or maternal. So you cannot really trust it when they say this is the father's side and this is the mother's side. It gets totally mixed up.
So is it a percentage that there is that
it's impossible to know. Just don't believe it. Just don't believe it.
Well, I was just curious into the extent whether there was a statistical error pattern. No.
It's hard to tell. No, it's just it's better if you know them, you can mark them yourself. You can change
Yes, I do.
what Ancestry's done. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
okay, it looks like we're running out of questions. Are there any more?
Yeah, I was just going to say, going back to the talk about South American countries, I have found family in Rio de Janeiro and the other place which I've forgotten. But anyway, I put a query out on the Jewish Gen list, and a very nice man who lives in Rio de Janeiro actually did some research for me and was able to rang them up and contacted them so that I was able to make contact. So that, there's always those kinds of possibilities.
Yeah.
And I have a very distant cousin in Uruguay who was able to do some research for me to find out about some of my other distant relatives in Uruguay and establish when they passed away. And so she was had connections into the Jewish community there, the communal records.
Yeah. One problem I had when researching my own family in South America was that there were some branches who went to South America and then hid the fact they were Jewish. The children then were raised as Roman Catholic, and it was only on the grandfather's deathbed that some of the family were told that they were actually Jewish. And so they had no connection to the Jewish community, and therefore it's actually very difficult to find anything out if you have no direct connection with them and no contact with them. And I also have family in Uruguay. Well, they were in Uruguay, now they're now all over the place. But yeah, and DNA was actually the link which proved that there was a connection.
Okay, so I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. When we had Michael and Paul talk to us back in last November, I think we all sort of sat back and said, wow, and let's have more of this. So we invited Michael to speak again, and I think he's lived up to expectations. demonstrating that out of nothing you can get something, and really quite extraordinary that someone who knew nothing, not even the name of their father, is able to find a first cousin. I'm blown away again. So yeah, thank you very much, Michael.
No, you're very welcome. And the only thing I would like to stress to you is we're running out of time. So if you know survivors or their families, get them to take DNA tests before it's too late.
And Max wanted me to remind you that this session has been recorded, and we will probably put it up on our website in coming weeks. Days. Okay, well, Max, you said that.
I put it up there, mate. Thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to stop.
Okay,
Thank you.
now.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay.